Welcome everybody to Biblical Resources. This is part of a series of lectures on the Easter stories. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 35. This story is greatly loved by many people. It is a very powerful story, and I hope it repays close reading and analysis. My hope is to open up the power and riches of the story so that when we hear it read on the third Sunday of Easter, it will mean even more to us. And for this presentation, as usual, I'm going to use some slides. So I'll start the slides and we can begin the talk itself. So welcome again to Luke chapter 24, 13 to 35. The sequence I'm going to use is a very short visual meditation to start. We'll read the Emmaus story in full. Then I'm going to propose using different filters to bring out the power of the story, the biblical and Jewish background, paying attention to the words, narrative analysis, multiple stories, the concentric layout, commentary, coming to Easter faith, and we'll close with a prayer. So I'm going to begin with the visual meditation. So I invite you to look at a number of paintings before we hear the story itself. The first painting is, of course, the Old Testament Trinity by Rublev, and clearly it refers to the hospitality of Abraham in the book of Genesis. However, in the multi-layered interpretation of the story, there's also a hint of the disciples on the road to Emmaus at the moment of the supper. A second very powerful picture is the one by Caravaggio, the disciples on the road to Emmaus at the dramatic moment of the breaking of the bread. And you can see the apostle on the disciple on the right is wearing a shell, a symbol of the pilgrimage to Santiago, a clear indication that the two disciples are on some sort of pilgrimage of faith. The next painting by Velázquez is one of my favorites. It's a maid in a kitchen, as you can see, and she catches this tremendous event out of the corner of her eye in the midst of the ordinary and the everyday. The scene itself is barely sketched, and the character catching it is really to the fore, signaling that these moments of theophany, the moments of closeness to God, come unexpectedly in the midst of the ordinary. My next two pictures are by a French painter, contemporary, Arquebas, who's almost obsessed by the Emmaus story. And in this first picture, he captures a key moment of the story when the disciples invite the Lord to stay with us. Stay with us, Lord. It is towards evening. You can catch the setting sun in his right elbow. In another fresco, the same Arquebas shows you the moment the two disciples are chatting, but something wonderful is happening. The bread is being broken. As often in Arquebas paintings, there's a cross. On this one, there are two, a black one and a gold one. We'll see another Arquebas painting towards the end. So by way of preparation for reading the Emmaus story, here are some questions. What would you say the single biggest issue for faith issue is today? And many would say is how to hand on the faith to other people, and in particular to the next generation. This is felt especially by grandparents and often by parents. It's felt too very much in parishes and schools, with catechists and parish pastoral workers and the various ministries struggling to find ways of passing on the faith today. It does raise a question: how can we help others make the journey to Easter faith? We know that faith is not a book of teachings or a deposit of doctrine, but a way and an encounter. And this is the very topic of the disciples on the road. So I hope the story will help us. And here it is. Now that very day, two of them were on their way to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about all the things that had happened. And while they were talking and debating these things, Jesus himself approached and began to accompany them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Then he said to them, "What are these matters you are discussing so intently as you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in these days?" He said to them, "What things?" "The things concerning Jesus the Nazarene," they replied, "a man who with his powerful deeds and words proved to be a prophet before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Not only this, but it is now the 3rd day since these things happened. Furthermore, some women of our group amazed us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back and said they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." So he said to them, "You foolish people, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things written about himself in all the scriptures. So they approached the village where they were going. He acted as though he wanted to go further, but they urged him, "Stay with us, because it is getting toward evening and the day is almost done." So he went in to stay with them. When he had taken his place at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. At this point, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Then he vanished out of their sight. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us while he was speaking with us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" So they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and those with them gathered together and saying, "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how they had recognized him when he broke the bread. Now, to explore this wonderful story, I'm going to use 5 filters. Filters are used, as you know, in photography to bring out different dimensions of light. Likewise here, and the 5 filters are the biblical and Jewish background, paying attention to the words, narrative analysis, one narrative, multiple stories, and the concentric pattern. And the hope is that these various filters will help us realize why this story is so powerful. So first of all, there is, of course, a broad biblical and Jewish background. There's reference to Moses, meaning the Pentateuch, the prophets, meaning the historical books and the prophets, and all the scriptures, possibly meaning the last part of the Old Testament, the so-called writings. To find out which texts resonated with the early Christians, read Luke Acts and see which texts are consistently referred to. For example, Isaiah 53, Psalm 110, Psalm 118, and so forth. By the same writer in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 4, there's a programmatic scene in verses 16 to 30, and the references there are to Isaiah 61 and 58, and to stories about Elijah and Elisha. The story that comes nearest, just in terms of story form, is that of Abram's hospitality to his 3 guests, unaware that they are angels actually God, of course, as the story unfolds. And finally, stepping outside the biblical and Jewish background, the ordinary Greco-Roman reader would be familiar with such stories about the gods in disguise approaching people unawares. And intriguingly, there are within the Jewish tradition stories of Elijah appearing unawares to people. So I have one to show you. I'll read it and leave it without comment. The young Eleazar, son of the great Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, was determined to make his own way in the world. He would not learn Torah and be a rabbi and teacher. He would make a career in the Roman government, which his father hated. At one point, the Romans put Eleazar in charge of animals and laborers who could be rented for trucking and transportation. Elijah, ever remembered for the good, disguised as an old man, came to him one time and said to him, "Get a beast of burden ready for me." Eleazar said, "And what do you have to load on the animal?" Elijah said, "I have this worn out water skin, my cloak, and myself as rider." Eleazar said to himself, "Take a look at this old man, whom I can pick up and carry to the end of the world, and he says to me, 'Get a beast of burden ready for me.'" So what did Eleazar do? He put Elijah on his back, took him up mountainsides and brought him down into the valleys, across fields of thorns and fields of thistles. Along the way, Elijah began to bear down upon him, making himself heavier and heavier. Eleazar said, old man, lighten yourself. If not, I shall throw you off." Elijah said, "Would you like to take a few breaths?" He replied, "Yes." So what did Eleazar do? He took Elijah to a field where he set him down under a tree and gave him something to eat and drink. After Elijah ate and drank, he asked Eleazar, "What will all this wandering about get you? Would it not be better for you to settle down and take up the trade of your ancestors?" Eleazar asked, "Can you teach me their occupation?" Elijah replied, "Yes." There are those who say that Elijah, ever remembered for the good, taught him for 13 years until he knew all of Sifra, the ancient teachings on the book of Leviticus. Once he was able to carry all of Sifra, he could not even carry his own cloak. It helps to pay attention closely to the words of Scripture. So I'm going to do a short analysis and then do a long one. The question I'm asking is, whose story is this? And what I want to notice is, how does the vocabulary compare to the vocabulary found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts? I'm going to look for vocabulary which is unique, that's to say it belongs purely to Luke, typical of Luke, that is, it occurs 50% more frequently in his writings, or words and phrases that are non-Lucan, only here but really belong elsewhere. And here's a small example from the first phrase of the reading. Now, this word occurs 28 times in Matthew, 0 in Mark, 26 times in Luke, and 8 times in Acts. So it's a word Luke Acts is comfortable with. 2, just simply the number, is found in Matthew 9 times, Mark 3 times, Luke 9 times, and Acts 7 times. So again, a word he's comfortable with. On the same day is found 0 in Matthew, 0 in Mark, twice in Luke, and not in the Acts. So here's an expression which is unique. Going, using one of the many words in Greek for go, 29 times in Matthew, 3 times in Mark, 51 times in Luke, and 37 times in Acts. So there's a word which is typical of Luke Acts, being used very frequently. The same may be said of the word village. 4 times in Matthew, 7 times in Mark, 12 times in Luke, and once in the Acts of the Apostles. So again, a word which is typical of the Lucan writings. That's a small sample. Here's a screen, don't be frightened by it, which shows you the whole story analyzed in terms of the vocabulary. The stuff in red is always unique, and the stuff in blue is words which are typical, occurring 50 times more frequently in Luke and in Luke Acts. We won't delay on this page, but to draw the results of that analysis, we may note the following. In unique vocabulary, that's to say expressions found only in Luke Acts, you have on the same day, Emmaus, talking, discussing, stranger, in these days, before, to redeem, since, morning, vision, foolish, slow, to interpret, to act as if, further, to urge, evening, to be at table, vanished, to return, to be gathered, to tell, the breaking of the bread. And strongly Lucan vocabulary, that's to say words occurring 50 times more frequently than in the other writings, going, village, Jerusalem, with each other, to draw near, to happen, man, leaders, to be condemned, to hope, to find, alive, necessary, to suffer, glory, to begin, to stay, to be nearly over, to bless, to be opened, not in the form of uki, to burn, to open, to get up, 11, appeared, and Simon. And if you ask, is there any non-Lucan vocabulary, that's to say a word which appears only here in Luke and elsewhere in nowhere else in Luke and perhaps elsewhere in the New Testament, and there's no non-Lucan vocabulary here, except perhaps for the word Emmaus, which occurs nowhere else either. To use a geological metaphor, there are no erratics in the story. So what does this mean? It means that there is no trace of a previous tradition which the writer made use of to present this story here. What about narrative analysis? It is a wonderful narrative, that is, a story with a plot, characters, and an outcome. Within the biblical tradition, it is in the form of a theophany, which is often a plot of knowledge. Somebody comes to a realization. It's a story unique to Luke, although the story of Philip and the eunuch in Acts is very like it. Both the Emmaus story and Philip and the eunuch belong to a type of folk tale in which the welcome to the unrecognized stranger turns out to be the decisive event of your life. In the Jewish tradition, as we saw, there are stories of Elijah exactly in this role. Finally, the Lucan version exhibits some of the typical features of resurrection appearance stories, that is, doubt, lack of recognition, revelation, and mission. Any fairly traditional story can be analysed in terms of the plot structure, the exposition, who are the characters, where and when, and so on. The inciting moment, that's when the story becomes interesting. The complication is the development of the story. The climax is where the story turns, so to speak. I'll pay attention to that in a moment, where the story resolves itself. And then you have the denouement, literally the unraveling, where the story comes to rest. Now I'm going to spend a bit of time on the climax, or the turning point of the story. There are different kinds of plots. In classical writing, so Aristotle, there are plots of action, and the turning point is some sort of reversal. There are plots of knowledge, and the turning point is a realization, some kind of insight. And outside the two types identified by Aristotle, there are also plots of character, where some person undergoes a significant change, a growth. Now, in a really good story, all three kinds of plot play a role. And this is true in the Emmaus story. All three kinds of plot are present, and the moment of climax varies accordingly in the story. For instance, there is a plot of knowledge. At this point, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. There's also a plot of character. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us while he was speaking with us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" a retrospective realization. And there's a very decisive plot of action. So they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem. So the story has different turning points within the one kind of complex plot. Here's a dimension often missed by commentators. The Emmaus story is made up of several stories which have been a little bit jumbled in sequence. Now, in the Emmaus story itself, the sequence is like this: the narrative of Jesus' condemnation and death, the narrative of Jesus' ministry, the narrative of the women at the tomb, the narrative of some of us at the tomb, the narrative of Old Testament hopes, the narrative of the appearance to Peter, and the narrative of the pilgrim's moment of recognition. So in effect, there are 7 stories within the story. If you were to sort them and put them in the proper order, it would look like this. There's the narrative of Old Testament hopes, so going way back to the scriptures. The narrative of Jesus' ministry, the narrative of Jesus' condemnation and death, the narrative of the women at the tomb, the narrative of some of us at the tomb, and the last 2 are probably contemporaneous. Narrative of the pilgrim's moment of recognition and the narrative of the appearance to Peter. Now, although there are 7 stories within the story, the ordinary reader doesn't feel jolted. That's because the story has a very unusual structure or pattern which lends a kind of order or tranquility to the telling. Very often in the Bible, stories are in chiastic or concentric patterns. Chiastic, the simplest one is A, B, B, A. So there's no center moment there. Or concentric patterns, A, B, C, B, A. In the Emmaus story falls into the concentric pattern, this A, B, a very elaborate A, B, C, B, A. And if you find a pattern like that, which is frequent enough in the Bible, you can always ask, is the physical center of the story the center of meaning? Is this what the story is truly about? And the next slide may help us to understand that a little better. So here's the story laid out in a particular pattern with colors, as you can see. So the verse 13, the same day Jerusalem going. Verse 14, they were talking to each other. 15 AB, Jesus drew near. 16, something prevented them recognizing him, and so on. The parts correspond in the following way. For instance, verse 13 corresponds to 33a at the bottom. In the same evening, Jerusalem and returning. Section B, verse 14, corresponds to B asterisk, they speak to each other. They were talking to each other, they speak to each other. Moment C, corresponding to C asterisk, Jesus himself drew near, and in 31b, Jesus disappears from them. In D, something prevented them from recognizing him, and in D asterisk, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And this patterning continues into the center part of the story. E and E asterisk are especially important. He makes a request which stops them. They stood still looking sad. And they make a request which stops him. Stay with us, Lord. And in the middle, you have the ministry, death, and tomb, but no insight. In G, verse 25, slowness of heart, slow to believe. And in F asterisk, ministry, death, and tomb in the light of the Old Testament. This tells us that there's considerable skill and artistry in the layout of the Emmaus story. It also tells us that the very center is slowness of heart, slow to believe. And you can ask the question, is the physical center of the story, so to speak, the meaning center? And the answer is, of course, yes. This is a story about how to overcome resistance to belief in Jesus risen from the dead, as we shall see. So, thus far, this is one of the most powerful stories in the New Testament, and we've used a number of filters to examine it: the biblical and Jewish background, paying attention to the words, the narrative analysis, multiple stories, and the concentric layout, which smooths out the potential jaggedness of the multiple stories. So part of the power of the story is multi-layered storytelling. It's not simple. Part of the power also lies in the story is rich in recognizable human experience. We had hoped. And part of the power of the story lies in the inexorable logic of the structure. It's going in a particular direction and takes us to that point of faith and arrival. So a quick commentary on the verses before doing a last analysis. So verse 13, now that very day, two of them are on their way to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. The reader is given limited information. The location of Emmaus is disputed, there being no fewer than 7 potential candidates. The traditional site now bears the name Abu Ghosh. The distance given is in Greek 60 stades. A Roman stade was a measure of distance of about 185 meters. So this amounts to slightly over 11 kilometers, and the 7 miles conversion is therefore fairly accurate. Initially, we are not told why the two were traveling, or at least at the start, even who they were. Verse 14, they were talking to each other about all the things that had happened. This is a fairly opaque reference to Jesus' last days, death and resurrection, and the phrase recurs further on in the telling. Why so laconic? Perhaps so as not to foreground these events again, recounted so vividly in the previous chapter, in order to put the emphasis not on the events, but on the inner journey of faith. Verse 15, while they were talking and debating these things, Jesus himself approached and began to accompany them. As usual in theophanies, the reader is informed of the identity of the mysterious stranger. The effect of this reader elevation is to turn the reader into an observer and correspondingly to lower somewhat the feeling of identification with the two disciples on the road. Verse 16, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. The non-recognition is essential to the setting up of the story. At the same time, it is a typical part of both theophanies and the resurrection appearance stories. In the New Testament, the passive form, their eyes were kept, would imply that the agent is God. Eventually, their eyes would be opened in verse 31, corresponding to the structure outlined just a moment ago. Verse 17, then he said to them, what are these matters you are discussing so intently as you walk along? They stood still, looking sad. At this moment, Jesus says something which stops them. Later, they will say something which stops him. In terms of drama, we suddenly have an insight into the feelings of the two travelers. They stood still, looking sad. Verse 18, and one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in these days? So finally, a name is given, Cleopas, while the other disciple remains anonymous. The pronouns used allow for either a man or a woman, although gender seems not to be an issue in this story. More powerful is the extraordinary level of irony and suspense. Jesus is the only one who knows exactly what has been happening in Jerusalem in these days. Verses 19 to 20, he said to them, what things? The things concerning Jesus the Nazarene, they replied, a man who, with his powerful deeds and words, proved to be a prophet before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. The summary given reflects Luke's outlook in the Gospel and in the Acts. Prophet is a key category for the presentation of Jesus in both volumes. Verse 21a, but we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Once more, an insight into the feelings, past and present, is given. With these touches, the characters become more real, more three-dimensional, so to speak, to the reader. Verses 21b to 24. Not only this, but it is now the third day since these things happened. Furthermore, some women of our group amazed us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back and said they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. This again is summary. The trip by some to the tomb takes us back to Peter's journey in Luke 24:12. There we are told that Peter went home amazed, an ambiguous expression. But here we are to understand those who went evidently saw or experienced nothing. Verse 25. So he said to them, "You foolish people, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken." This is the central moment of the Emmaus story. The purpose of the narrative is to overcome slowness of heart and to invite a new reading of the prophets and the death of Jesus in the light of the resurrection. Verse 26. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and enter into his glory? Necessary is a hint that behind the destiny of Jesus stands God as agent. Once again, the summary statement is pure Luke. Verse 27. Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things written about himself in all the scriptures. Moses here means the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible traditionally attributed to Moses. All the prophets includes not only what we would regard as the prophetic books, but also the histories, so Judges, Joshua, 1 and 2 Samuel, as well as 1 and 2 Kings. Verse 28. So they approached the village where they were going. He acted as though he wanted to go further. It looks as if the mysterious character, having walked into their lives, is now walking out of their lives. This is the essential step leading to verse 29. But they urged him, "Stay with us, because it is getting toward evening and the day is almost done." So he went in to stay with them. They ask him to stay with them. This moment of expressed desire captures the essential movement of the heart which marks faith in Jesus risen. The believer's desire to have the Lord in their lives. They make a choice. Without this essential movement of the heart, all the other features of coming to Easter faith would be ineffective. Verse 30. When he had taken his place at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. The verbs remind the reader, of course, of the Lord's Supper and the subsequent breaking of the bread across the Acts of the Apostles. Verse 31. At this point, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Then he vanished out of their sight. This moment corresponds to the earlier, their eyes were kept from recognizing him. The vanishing resembles the relocation of Philip, when he also vanishes without warning from the presence of the Ethiopian eunuch. Verse 32. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us while he was speaking with us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" Notice that the two do not register their present state, but the previous experience earlier on the road. Often we recognize what was happening only in retrospect. Verse 33. So they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and those with them gathered together. The journey is reversed immediately as they gain new energy from the discovery of faith. The whole atmosphere of disappointment and despondency is dispelled. Finally, verses 34 and 35, and saying, "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how they recognized him when he broke the bread. In Jerusalem, the believers there have a story to proclaim, and the travelers tell their tale of recognition. In this way, faith is both mutually discerned and mutually strengthened. So, this is a story of coming to Easter faith. In the opinion of many, my opinion too, this story is a creation of Luke, a very able storyteller. Every part of it, the structure, the narrative power, the vocabulary, the theology, all show the marks of Lucan insight and writing skill. It's designed to meet the needs of much later generations. Now, how can a much later generation come to the same powerful Easter faith? It might just preserve a very distant memory of a story of two on the road, garbled in Mark chapter 16, where we read this. After this, he appeared in a different form to two of them while they were on their way to the country. They went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. However, as it stands now, as we now have it, Luke 24, 13 to 35 is a catechetical example story. It portrays the many factors at play on the journey to Easter faith. On the next slide, I have tried to list these in some coherent fashion. So there are four headings: knowing the story, the inner journey, Jesus, and the community witness. So the writer wants us to notice what are the marks, the characteristics, the stages of coming to Easter faith. So the first of these is knowing the story. That means two stories: the Old Testament story and the ministry and destiny of Jesus. The second category is the inner journey. So we did get quite inside the characters of the two disciples on the road. So awareness of longing, we had hope, slowness to believe, desire, stay with us, elusive epiphanies, so as soon as he's recognized, he's gone, and the power of retrospective insight. Didn't our hearts burn with us on the road? The figure of Jesus is portrayed as the unrecognized companion on the way, and it illustrates the sovereign self-presentation. So the Lord reveals himself or presents himself to people, and that cannot be arranged. That's his gift and his power. And the words from the lips of Jesus invite a rereading of the scriptures in the light of the resurrection and a rereading of Jesus' destiny in the light of the scriptures. And finally, the community witness is marked in three moments: the women at the tomb, foundational; word and sacrament, because the story contains an explanation of scripture and a hint of the Lord's Supper; and finally, the shared confirmation of faith. The community has a story and the two on the road have a story, and they are able to share their stories and find their faiths mutually discerned and mutually enriched and confirmed. So the Emmaus story is offered by Luke, the evangelist, to help later generations come to the same powerful. This is a set of ingredients and just mix them and you'll be okay. He's saying these are the typical features which we would inhabit in different strengths at different moments in our lives. And the story allows us to reflect too on our own journey of faith in the Easter Jesus. To close with a prayer. O God of mystery, out of death you delivered Christ Jesus as he walked in hidden glory with his disciples. Stir up our faith, that our hearts may burn within us at the sound of his word, and our eyes be opened to recognize him in the breaking of the bread. Grant this through Jesus Christ, the firstborn from the dead, who lives with you now and always, in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God, forever and ever. Amen. So I'm going to close down the slides. So thank you very much for your patience in paying attention to this short lecture on Luke 24:13 to 35. I hope it's been useful to you and will help you to benefit from the reading next Sunday, the third Sunday of Easter. Thanks very much, everybody.